So this is just the title of our discussion, so we can go to the next slide. This is what we'll be covering today: board composition, the seats, the board responsibilities, the voting rights, and the board charter. Next slide. Yeah, so what comprises a board, right? Starting from the top, usually a board will have a chair, right? So the apex of the board is a chairman, and sometimes the chairman will be an executive chairman. Executive chairman means that in addition to being a board member, this person is involved in the day-to-day running of the organization. For example, at Viewgrow Africa, we have Rob Baer as the executive chairman. So he's a co-founder and the executive chairman. That means that on a day-to-day, he's working with Viewgrow. But that's optional. It's not always the norm, right? The next person on the list is a CEO. Sometimes the CEO also acts as a secretary to the board. And then we have the other co-founders and directors. And those top four, number two to four, are what we call executive committee in a board, right? So yourself, I know, Nicola, you said you don't have a board. So if we go to your CR12, if we pull your name and your other directors and founders, that already is a board. And we call that the executive committee, right? And then there are other board members that are invitees, right? Or rather, you appoint them, not invitees, but appointed board members. So de facto board members are the company directors. Over and above the company directors, you invite other people to join your board, right? And these other board members is on a term basis. So it's a 3-year term, a 2-year term, renewable, but you reserve the right to renew, extend their term. But at the end, the directors, the founders will always remain in the board, right? In addition to the executive committee, which is the founders, we have subcommittees within the board. You can have a subcommittee on finance, you can have a subcommittee on strategy, a subcommittee on remuneration, a subcommittee on HR. I advise you keep maximum of 3 subcommittees. And what subcommittees can do is, before they already set board meetings, subcommittees can meet almost ad hoc to discuss. For example, if an audit is coming out, the finance subcommittee might want to meet and review it before it's taken to the main board. So you can keep setting up these subcommittees as per the needs, right? In addition to board members, up to number 6, we also have observers, right? So you find that some investors, when they put money in your company, they'll want a board seat. And if you already have a bloated board, let's say you already have a 9-member board, it doesn't make sense to add a 10th and the 11th board member. So at that point, you say, okay, I can't give you a board seat, but I can give you an observer seat. An observer means that you are invited to the board, but typically you don't have more of a vote in that board meeting. You're more of an observer. You can comment and your comments will be noted. But when it comes to voting, you really are not voting in that meeting, but you're observing the meeting, you're taking note of what's happening, and you're able to participate. Up to there, is there any question? I want to make sure that I don't lose you, so you can keep the questions coming as we go. All right. Tom, did you say something?
No, I wanted to say no question. It's well understood.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide. So there are instances where you'll have different entities. You have a holdco and an opco. Holdco means a holding company, and opco means the operating company. You've heard about Delaware-based company. I mean, some people, when they try to fundraise, they try to set up a holdco in a place like Delaware, or in a place where we say it's a tax-efficient domicile, right? What that means is that some investors are not comfortable putting their money in a Kenyan entity, for example, or Ugandan entity, because they know that when the exit happens, they're going to have to part with a huge sum of money under what we call a capital gain tax. In some of our countries, the capital gain tax is as high as 15%, 20%, even more. Here in Kenya, I know there are plans to even revise upwards. So that means that if I made a return on my investment as an investor, I'm going to be parting with 15 to 30% of my money in terms of tax. So I'd rather invest in startups that have a hard core in a tax-friendly jurisdiction like Delaware or Mauritius, among other countries. Some of the countries actually have zero capital gain tax. So that's why you have HoldCo and OpCo in some scenarios. So you might be forced to set up in Delaware while still operating in Egypt, in Uganda, in Kenya. So in that case, you can have two sets of board. You can have the main governance board within the HoldCo, right? So you'd transfer your directorship to the holding company in Delaware, and you become a board member there, including all the investors that you've given a board seat. And that's where the main decisions are made of the organization. Subsequently, if the OpCo is also large enough with large operations and it feels that they need a direction from the board, they can also set an OpCo advisory board or a governance board. That means you can say within Africa, this is our board. Within Kenya, within this kind of region, we have this local board, right, which advises us on the local matters and local realities. However, some of the decisions at the OpCo will still need a final approval from the HoldCo. For example, if you want to take a loan to run your operations, for example, Neurolabs, you have Neurolabs in Delaware, and you have Neurolabs here in Kenya, and you want to take a debt or a loan, the HoldCo might have the final say, because the HoldCo is a shareholder in the OpCo, right? It owns the majority of the OpCo. So if you take a loan and you default, it means that it will affect the HoldCo. So in such decisions, even if the local board had approved you to take a loan, the final say will remain with the HoldCo, right? So the HoldCo is the final decision maker. All right. Any question there? Else we keep moving. You can also put the questions on the chat, which I'll discuss at the end of the presentation. Next. Now, let's look at number of board seats, voting, and frequency of meetings. I advise against having a huge board, right? Because you can't move, you can't reach decision points if you have 10, 12 people all sharing different views. So typically go for 5 to 7 seats at any particular time, right? Now, if you already have, let's say some companies already have 5 founders, right? So it means that if you get 2 more board directors, you're already at 7. How do you minimize that? So on the top right there, I've put that option that the executive committee, the one I showed at the beginning, which is the founders, they can nominate 1 or 2 founders to represent them in the board, right? So for example, at Vilgro Africa, we are 3 co-founders. We could say, okay, let us have Robert, or let's have Wilfred represent us in the board, right? So that we are not all 3 of us at the same time trying to vote and be on the board, so that we decongest the board. So sometimes you might choose, especially if you have so many co-founders, the executive committee can nominate 1 or 2 founders to represent them in the board, right? So, and that when they represent you, it means that they have all the voting rights of the directors together, right? So when they represent you there, if it comes to voting by shares, you'll be, since you're representing them, the total votes there will be the entire executive committee votes added together. As I earlier said, in addition to the ExCo, you should have 2 or 3 other subcommittees, which can be strategy, fundraising, compliance, finance, and things like that. In terms of frequency of meetings, we recommend about 4 times a year. That means every quarter they're having a meeting. All right, up to there, are we together? If you have a burning question, you can also come off mute and ask your question. All right, next slide. Now, what is the responsibilities of a governance board? So here we're going to try to demystify the difference between governance and advisory board, right? So governance board main job is oversight or supervising, right? They oversee, they supervise management, they give oversight on financial matters, they give oversight on strategy and strategic directions. They might also give you access to networks. They also ensure you are compliant. So they also give oversight on matters compliance in terms of audits, tax, ethical standards, values, etc. Right? The governance board also selects, or it can select a CEO and evaluate his or her performance, right? So if you look at, for example, Safaricom, when we come to hiring a CEO of a company like Safaricom, it's a board that actually interviews and finally appoints the CEO, right? Initially, as a startup, you might not give them that much power, but over time, as you raise more and more funding and you're growing, especially by the time you think you want to step out from your CEO role, let's say you've run your company for 10 years and you want to move on to the next thing. At that point, maybe you want to give these powers to the board to appoint your successor, right? And evaluate his or her performance and that kind of a thing. The governance board can also set the compensation level, right? They can also set the C-level compensation. They can say, from this level to this level, this is how much we've allowed you to pay yourself. And that's governance board. So you can see a governance board is quite tight, right? They have much more mandate because they are actually directors in your company. They are non-shareholding directors in your company. So they have some liability, and that's why they have to exercise their fiduciary duty, their oversight duty, because if anything went wrong and there was a litigation or something, then the board will be held answerable. So they have to hold you with a very tight leash. I can see some questions. Maybe I can respond to these two as we keep going. So Flora, maybe you can elaborate what you meant by your question. Are you talking about my first slide, where I showed executive committee and other board members?
Yes.
So the roles that I've put on this slide, those are the roles of the entire board, which includes executive and non-executive members. So non-executive means that they are not day-to-day running the affairs of the company, right? You're not having them show up in your weekly meetings and help you run your operations. That's what we mean by non-executive director. The founders on the other side are executive because they are running the day-to-day affairs, and including an executive chairman who can also be involved in the day-to-day of the organization. So other than the day-to-day, the non-executive, so the non-executive will play their roles that I've put on this slide, right? They'll give oversight, strategy direction, compliance issues, fiduciary duties, all that, right? So that's their main job. Then there's a question from Chiliza, says, can you explain remuneration for board members, especially for startup? That's a very good question. If you don't have a budget, you'd like these board members to remain pro bono, right? They're giving their services without getting paid. There are other ways you can incentivize them, including things like shares, but I would ask you to be careful about that, because If you go that direction, then you have to have a way of measuring if they've added value, right? You have to have a way of vesting the shares, right? Let's say you give 1% to the entire board for offering this service. That 1% needs to be vested in a period where you'll be satisfied that they served their term, they steered the company in the right direction, and hence it makes sense to give them some shares. That is not the norm. That is not the norm. So don't quickly go to that route. It's not as straightforward, but it's just an option. If you have a bit of financial muscle, you can give a small allowance. It's not really compensation, but an allowance of, let's say, $200 per sitting. Companies that are doing very, very well, like listed companies and all that, those ones are able to pay board members a proper compensation. But for a startup, you can see what makes sense for you, right? And initially, you don't want to start by paying. Initially, you want to, especially as you're setting up, you want people who are willing to just give their time because they believe in the dream, they believe in the impact, they want to be part of your story, and that's why they are giving your time. And honestly, there are more than enough people willing to do that. If they see you're going to have impact in the community, more often people are willing to give their time to be part of this story, to be part of your impact story. So I would start with that. Then after you raise, let's say you've raised below $500,000, you shouldn't be talking compensation. But by the time you've raised maybe $1 million, $2 million going upwards, maybe at that point you can afford $200 per sitting type of stipend. The other question from Chris Silali: can a founder director be an executive board member? Yes. If we are, let's say, again, using the example of ViewGrow Africa, so it's myself, Rob, and Robert as the three founders. If one day I left ViewGrow in my role as a CEO, it means that I'll still be a founder of the company, but I'm not in the day-to-day. So I become an executive board member, right? And I can go and pursue other interests. So that's right. So for example, one day, Chris, you want to go and set up your next startup and you're leaving Gene Plus. From that point onwards, you become an executive board member, right? The other question is difference between company directors and board members in respect to shareholding. I think we can separate the two, but I don't think it's entirely on shareholding. But what happens is that founders or directors already have shareholding from the word go. These are the founders of the company, so they have their nominal shares, and they tend to be having a good chunk of their shareholding. But remember, as you're continuing to fundraise, that shareholding gets diluted, right? So it's not based on shareholding that we call you a company director. I think we are calling you a company director based on the founding role of the company, which makes you a founding director of the company. And then shareholding is neither here nor there. You can still be a director with very little shareholding or with a lot of shareholding. And sometimes we also have board members with a bit of shareholding, which is not the norm. So it's less likely for a board member, an invitee or an appointed board member is very less likely for them. It's not the norm, right? They might have shares in the company, but it's not the norm. You can invite anyone. You can invite me on this call to become a board member, and I am not required to have any shares in the company. All right. Let's keep going. We can look at the next slide. Now, remember we were talking about governance board. Sorry.
I think I saw Tom's hand up. I don't know if he still has a question, but yeah.
Sure.
Okay, Wilfred, I wanted to, what you mentioned about remuneration of board, when to move to shares, probably. So I wanted to know whether you'll be discussing more on that at the presentation. Could wait till the end. or you're moving now to advisory board?
You can wait till the end, and then we'll see whether we can cover it in this call, or we can do a one-on-one session with you, right? But we can maybe we go till the end so that we can look at that.
Okay.
So what's the difference between a governance board and an advisory board? Remember, we said governance board has oversight, they have fiduciary duty, they are liable in as far as the company is concerned. They can represent the company on your behalf, right? While advisory board doesn't have that power, right? Advisory board doesn't sign off on anything. They don't have much of a say. All they do, as the name suggests, is give you advice. So we advise companies to start off with an advisory board because it gives you the rigor, and you get in the discipline of organizing board meetings, preparing board presentations, sharing board minutes. So you are exercising. We can call it a mock board, right? Quote unquote, a mock board, right? Because in the absence of governance board, they will ask you the same questions that your board would have asked you, right? And it's you to give them how much mandate you want to give them. But at the end of the day, they don't have really legal power to maybe exercise voting and all that. You might get their opinion, but they are not like as binding as the governance board. They should serve as accountability partners with no liability or any fiduciary obligation. They play an advisory role. It can be a technical advisory role. For example, you're building a hardware or a technology product that requires a bit of oversight from people who have done that before. You know, people who have built products, people who have scaled technology companies. Those are good people to have on your advisory board, and they can advise you on matters technical. You can also have an advisory board member who advises you on regulatory, right? Let's say you want to scale from one country to another, and you want to know the requirements of registering, setting up, and those kind of things, especially in fields that are very sensitive, like healthcare, which is highly regulated. You need to have someone who is well experienced in those matters. So this one, you look at your needs, and then you bring advisory members based on your needs, right? In the absence of a formal board, the advisory board might act as a precursor to the governance board, right? So as I said, you start off with an advisory board. You get, if I'm an investor in your company and I'm trying to get in, and I come and you tell me you don't have a governance board, and you also don't have an advisory board, then I'll be very worried, right? You should have at least one of them. Some companies will choose to have both governance and advisory board. So advisory board, you can also reach out to them more than once a quarter, right? These are people you can get on a phone with even more regularly. While a governance board, you have a bit of a distance, right? For governance board to function very well, you don't want them to be too much involved in your day-to-day affairs. Otherwise, they are not able to give, there'll be a lot of conflict, right? Conflict of interest. So you'd rather keep some separation between governance and your operations. But for advisory member, since you're seeking them for advice, you can have them more and more often. You can have regular touch points, right? Both formal and informal. Yeah. Some people also have their mentors as part of their advisory board. So those are the two distinctions. One is more powerful and more legally binding, and they appear even in your company documents. Those are the governance board members. And they exercise, they have more power, they have more mandate over you, including selecting a CEO, firing a CEO, and things like that, signing off on your audits, while advisory board might advise you on all those matters, but they don't have a mandate per se, right? So for those in the core that say they don't have any kind of a board, I would encourage you to start with an advisory board. Next slide. All right. Now here we introduce AGM, right? Remember, even though the governance board has all those powers, it's also It's borrowed power, right? They are acting on behalf of the shareholders. The people who have the real power at the end of the day are the shareholders, who are usually meet during an AGM. It can be a special purpose AGM or a regular AGM. So the AGM in well-functioning companies have a say on board matters. They have a say on who they want to sit on the board, right? So they might remove a director from the board. They might re-elect a board member. So these are the real owners, right? So when you talk about AGM, you're talking about shareholders who are the real owners of the company. Yeah. The AGM also approves financial statements, right? So when you go to an AGM, you need to have prepared the same way you prepare for a board. You need to prepare the same way to update them on shareholding matters, dividends. How did we perform, or where are we heading, right? Are we raising more capital? What is our expansion plan? So these are the owners of the company, right? So shareholders can vote to approve the financial statements, including balance sheet, income statement, cash flow. So if you go to them with your audit, they might vote to approve, or they might disapprove and send you back to do more work. Dividend declarations, again, the shareholders vote to approve the declaration and distribution of dividends. This is a step further down, right? I don't think any of you is at that level yet of having AGMs, but AGMs are quite useful, especially when you've brought so many other shareholders to the company and they can't all be represented on the board. They need another mechanism of being able to air their views. Appointment of external auditors. Again, shareholders can vote to appoint or appoint external auditors. So they have that power to say that we're not happy with this audit report. We are not happy with this auditor. Can we change to another one? Amendments of articles of association. Shareholders can vote on proposed changes or amendments of articles of association or bylaws, including shareholders' agreement. They can also vote on changes on that, right? The last one is significant corporate actions. Shareholders may vote on major actions like a merger, right? Say you want to merge your company, or you want to sell your company, or you want to acquire a new company, or you're going to split your shares, or you're going to build incur a major capital expenditure, maybe to build a factory. Again, these are the shareholders, they deserve the right to know. So you need to keep a way of updating them. It's not as regular as the board. You typically would have one annual general meeting every year, right? Just to make sure that people who are owning stock in your company are aware of how things are progressing. Then on the board side, what can the board vote on? The board can vote on strategic direction, right? They are, as I said earlier, they are responsible for making strategic decisions for the company, both short-term and long-term goals. Executive appointments, again, they can vote to appoint or remove CEO and any other C-level person. Financial planning and budgeting, again, they approve your annual budget. So if you have a governance board, every beginning of your financial year, by practice, you're required to take to the board. So yeah, you always have the first board meeting of the year. That's where you should get all these approvals for the year. What's the operational work plan for the year? What's the operational budget? What is the capital raising plans? And you get them to vote on all that, right? Risk management, again, the board can, by accessing the oversight duty, they are able to oversee companies' risk mitigation strategies and pointing out the major risks in the company. Policy development, again, the board can, especially if you have the subcommittees. Let's say you have the subcommittees we spoke about earlier, like a remuneration subcommittee. That means every time you are revising your remuneration policy, that subcommittee should be able to approve or have a voice on that, right? Then monitoring and oversight. Again, the board should be able to monitor your overall performance, the financial health, and your compliance. Lastly, which is very important for startups, resolution to raise capital. we've seen a lot of startups that go and raise chunks of money without having gotten the board resolution. So if the board doesn't give you the resolution to take a loan or to take a funding, when you go back to the AGM and the shareholders are not happy that you went and raised money, they'll put the board to the task and ask them, did you approve this? Yeah. Where is the resolution? So to protect yourself, it's always good to run by the board some of these things. And you don't need a board meeting to do a resolution. You can actually, it can be done on email where you share materials and say, these are our projections, this is how much we need, and this is our growth plan, and this is the use of funds. Can you vote, or can you sign off this resolution to raise capital? All right, next slide. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand or put it on the chat. Voting rights. So each company has, the same way a country has a constitution, you have your own bylaws, your articles of association, which guide how the company will be run, right? So before you even go ahead to appoint your board, you should have a look again at your bylaws and the things that you wanna put there, because trying to put them later will be harder because it will require voting, right? If you go, you can't, once you have a board, some of these bylaws will require their approval for you to change. So make sure your bylaws are tight, your articles of association are tight, and there's clarity. Because after that, this is your constitutional document. It gives powers to the shareholders, it gives powers to the board, it gives voting rights to the different people. So as I said, voting rights are determined in the company bylaws and is based on the class and type of shares held by the shareholder, right? So sometimes you might have ordinary shares, others you might have both ordinary and preferential shares. Typically, ordinary shares have a bigger say when it comes to voting, while preference shares are secondary to in terms of voting rights, right? So you start with the ordinary shares in terms of voting rights, then preference. Preference shares just means that you'll be the first one to be paid in terms of when a liquidation event happens or the company is winding down, we pay out the preferential shareholders first before we pay the ordinary shareholders. So you as a founder of the company should have majority of the ordinary shareholder, and any other person who wants to have more of a voting power can have ordinary shares. Now, even the preferred shares have several categories. There's class 1, class 2, class 3, and you keep defining in your company documents the voting power, right? You can say for this class of shares, every share has 2 votes. For this other class, every share is equal to 1 vote. For this other class, so you classify them, especially as you continue raising and you go into Series A, Series B, Series C. By the time you reach Series C, there are so many vested interests and so many people on your cap table that it makes sense to classify, because then decision making is much more complex when you reach that stage. Again, at that stage, you should also be guided by a lawyer. By the time you reach classification of shares and voting rights, also just don't do it on your own. Seek advice, right? As I said, that voting power can be determined by the number of shares, the class of shares, and any specific voting agreements or arrangements. Sometimes you can have special voting agreements, again, enacted in the company bylaw. There are some mechanisms. So the other question will be, how do I ensure I have majority voting rights, especially after I've raised and I've gotten fully diluted, right? So by the time you are Series B, Series C, you've raised $50 million. By then, you'll be lucky if you own more than 5% of the company. Most of the times, by the time you're in Series C, maybe you'll only own 2% of the company as a founder. So how do you continue having a say in matters voting, right? So the thing you can do here is classify the shares give more voting rights, especially shareholders that come much later on. You want to give them less voting power per share, right? It doesn't make sense. Someone who came 7 years down the line in Series B, Series C, and they're going to be buying a bigger chunk, you want to try to minimize the voting right per share compared to people who came earlier on. Right? Again, this is quite complex. You should seek support and advice when you start going into that kind of classification and of shares. Next slide. Now, board charter. So if you're setting up a board for the first time, in the letter that you send to invite the board member, it's good that you give them clear description of their JD, their job description, their roles and responsibilities, so that they know what is their mandate, where does it start, where does it end, and avoid confusion later on, right? So as they sign off the letter of appointment, you should annex the charter, the board charter. So basically, the board charter should cover the next 8, 9 areas. One is the purpose and objectives. So you define clearly what is the purpose of the board, what are the objectives of the board, and you can quote some of your company bylaws so that they know where they sit within your constitutional documents. The board charter will also specify board composition. So if you invited me to the board, I want to know, how big is your board? Is it 5? Is it 7? What's the composition? What are the qualifications of the board members? And including details of independent directors, the board committees, diversity considerations, and things like that, right? The other thing you should put in the board charter is the roles and responsibility. Again, this you can put in bullet points. Don't make it a huge document. Just summarize it and say, these are the 5 main roles, right? And you can customize the responsibilities per each board member, because we are not all coming to the same committee. Maybe you are appointing me to your board to help you with fundraising. So it should be clear, why are you inviting me to the board? Within the larger context of oversight, what specifically do you want from me as Wilfred? And that can be introductions to investors, financial oversight. You stipulate in bullet points what you expect to me as a board member, collectively as a body, but also individual responsibilities of each member. So there's 2 parts. There's overall responsibilities, which includes meeting every quarter, reviewing your audits, doing this, doing that. And then there's more specific responsibilities for each board member, right? In the board charter, you should also put your decision-making process. Again, if your bylaw stipulates, you can also quote it there. And you say, this is how we'll be making decisions. Maybe we'll be voting by, it's by majority vote, and this is how we'll be making our decisions. This is how we'll be setting our agendas. Then you can also tell them the frequency of board meetings, the notice requirements, how long in advance will you be sending the board materials, and any other expectation on conduct of the board, right? You should also tell me in the board charter whether there is committees and the composition and the responsibilities of each committee, especially if you're appointing me and you're putting me in a finance committee, for example. I need to know the responsibility of that committee. Then board evaluation and succession planning. Again, you should tell me, how long is the term? How will you evaluate me? And what's the succession planning? At what point can I get out? And what process do you have in place to ensure there is no vacuum, so that we don't have all the board members leaving at the same time? I would advise that if you have a board of 5 members, sorry, you shouldn't let go more than 2 members in any particular year. So you should have a way of rotation where you're keeping the old guard as you bring the new guard, right? You should also put something on the code of conduct, a bit high level, things like conflict of interest. You should have there that if you have conflict of interest, this is how we need you to go about it, and this is how we need you to declare ahead of time. And you can tell them what does a conflict of interest constitute? Reporting and communication, again, what's the mode of communication? Is it email? Is it phone? Is it, so you just summarize in a very simple terms, the roles, responsibilities, and operating principles of the board, right? So that I know what I'm getting myself into. It would be shocking if I just joined your board and then find that maybe you're meeting more than 4 times. You're meeting maybe every 2 months, but that was nowhere in the board charter. So I didn't know what I was signing myself into, including issues to do with the remuneration. You shouldn't leave it like blank that you say nothing about it. So when I'm coming in, I don't know whether I'll get the $200 sitting allowance or whether I'm gonna be voluntarily. I need to know that ahead of time, right? So put that also in the board charter. All right, next slide. I think we're almost there, so that we leave the last. Yeah, we are done. So we can open the floor for questions. Please unmute and raise your question. You can also raise your hand as I look at the chat here. So Flora asked the question of advice on compensation of board of advisors. Again, I would refer to the same answer I gave for the governance board. It's purely up to your discretion to see whether you have the budget to be able to compensate. Typically, I think for startups, anything between $100 to $200 per sitting is fair, but you don't have to if you don't have the money. And as you grow and you see the value they are bringing, then you can keep increasing that as you go. Nicola asked a question on any tips on approaching the voluntary board members for the early days. Good question. And I would almost ask the question back to you that if Nicola, today I invited you to Viewgraphic as a board member on voluntary basis, how would I appeal to you, right? I would first maybe go to your, I need to know you very well, look at your LinkedIn profile, know what you're up to, and I see your interests. Then I try to align Vilgro's mission to your personal interests. That's the only way, right? If my interests are not aligned to your organizational interests, there's no way I'm going to be serving there for free. So there needs to be a form of alignment in terms of, if I'm all about social change and creating a better world, and I see your startup is exactly doing that, and you communicate very well how you're going to make change, then for sure I'll be happy to serve, right? So it's more about alignment than anything else.
Wilfred,
Yes.
maybe I'll ask one question. So for new founders, who are starting off, if they want to set up a board tomorrow, next week, what's a starting point? What's a good starting point for them?
Excellent question. You should start by asking yourself, what are your needs? Why do you need a board to start with? You're not just doing it because it's required or to look good, but you're doing it to help you. So you start by looking at your needs. For example, I might have needs around expansion. I want to figure out how to expand to Uganda, Tanzania, Congo. I have no idea. I need someone to guide me. So there's a need already on expansion. I have a need on, I don't know whether I'm keeping my books very well. Remember, you can't be a striker and a goalkeeper at the same time and a referee at the same time, right? So maybe I have a need where, okay, I've been doing my books, but I don't know. I approve them myself. I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing. I need someone to guide me, someone that I can be, someone who holds me accountable, someone that I can be reporting to. So there's a need there, right? So you list your top 3 needs. It can be financial oversight, it can be scaling, it can be expansion, it can be fundraising. And you say, okay, these are my needs. So when I search for board members, I'll be looking at profiles that have this and this and this kind of needs, right? So start with your needs, first of all. Then number 2, you start looking at your networks, who is able to qualify to meet those needs. You can ask people to introduce you. And this could be people like your mentors, your other colleagues. They can recommend people to sit on there. Like at ViewGrow, I know almost 2 or 3 board members were recommended by other people within the organization. We actually used to have a board member that was recommended by an employee, and this was a very junior employee who recommended and said, I know this person who has these qualifications, I think they will be good for your board. And we took that chance. So those are the different ways of looking for board members. You should have a courting period. Don't just invite them day one. Have like 2-3 months of talking, engaging. Send them your reports and get their views. Meet them for coffee. Invite them to some of your meetings. Get to know whether there is a good chemistry between you and them, and then from there you can go.
Thank you so much.
That's amazing. I like the insights and how sounds very optimistic. However, I would also like to know, for instance, when do you graduate your advisory board to a board of directors, and how do you come up with this, let's call it a job description? So I might know what they might do for the next 2-3 years, but what happens after that? Because I don't really know what might happen 3 years from now, or what their duties might be. I might know in the next 2 years they're going to be doing this and this and this. But again, after the 3 years, you have no idea at all what their roles will be and what they'll be doing at that time. And also, once you have an advisory board, there's some things that you note, especially when you start getting investors and you start getting money. They're kind of holding back knowledge because they don't feel, I won't call it the vibe, what they don't feel like they are being rewarded. So they're like, someone comes in, gets this, I've been doing this for this time, but there's nothing for me. So basically it boils back to the first question. And of course, you mentioned about having a description, this board governance, let's call it a job description, then that vests over time. So for instance, if you agree for a 4-year period, the first 50% will vest after X and B has been achieved. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so 2 things I would say here. One is that not every advisory board member should become your governance board member. It's not an automatic graduation. I would say you can set a governance board from scratch, and you can decide to continue keeping the advisory board or do away with the advisory board altogether. But it's not automatic graduation. I mean, some of the advisory members might be very good for you on the governance side, but it's not automatic, right? So it's you to make the decision. Then on the jobs and job description, keep that fluid, right? If let's say the needs of the organization today was expansion, 1 year down the road, that need is no longer there. You can see how else to repurpose and give me more different roles, right? So it's fluid. Remember, this is not like a job contract, which is very tight. For the board, is very fluid, right? They need to help you. At the end of the day, as I said, it should boil down to the needs of your organization. If it reaches a point where they are no longer serving your needs, at that point, you can do away with. You can, in a good way, let them go, right? So you feel, and you thank them. Again, whenever you're graduating your board members, it's always good to appreciate what they helped you achieve. Do a nice post about it. At ViewGrow, we actually do a proper LinkedIn post whenever a new board member is joining and whenever a board member is graduating. I think this week, something should be coming up, Edwin, about a new board member that you're bringing on. So we try to, again, because you're not, even if you're giving them an allowance of $100, really, they are worth much more than that. So you can't really fully pay a board member as a startup. Unless you become a blue chip listed company, what we are talking about here is just a stipend. You can't really pay for their time, right? They could make more money elsewhere. So you have to find other ways of appreciating them. For example, at Wilgrow, we try to, whenever there's a conference and they are within, the conference is happening in the region, we can pay for their attendance tickets. Whenever there's different networking opportunities, we invite them. So there are other ways of keeping them very, very motivated. And again, ask them before they join, why are they joining your board, so that you are all aligned. Some of them will say, I'm joining because I'm passionate about what you're doing for women and children, and that's my passion, and I'm happy to give my time. We had a board member who said that they wanted to join the board to stay young. They said that I can't keep up with the new trends and technology, and this thing is rapidly evolving. For me to stay young and stay up to date, I would like to serve in your board, right? So you can see those are very different alignments on incentives that are not monetary. All right. I see we have 1 minute to go. Any last question before we call it a day? So feel free to reach out to us if you have, if you need a more like a customized response, or you have a very specific need that you don't want to share here. We are happy to help you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wilfred. And thank you everyone who's been able to attend. Yes, I guess we are at time, and so we'll end it there today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Edwin, for organizing, and thank you for the audience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.